My husband ordered me to say sorry to his female best friend after my truth hurt her feelings. When I refused, he yelled, "Apologize or I'll divorce you." I agreed. At her house, I faced her and, right before her husband, said something that made them both realize why women like me never kneel before lies. Can you believe my husband actually told me to apologize to the woman he was having an emotional affair with, or he'd divorce me? And the worst part, he thought he'd won. He had no idea what was coming next. Mason, my husband of 5 years, stood in our living room with his arms crossed, delivering that ultimatum like it was some negotiable business deal. Apologize to Scarlett, or I'll divorce you. His face was set in that expression I'd come to know too well over the past months. The one that screamed I was being unreasonable, jealous, impossible to deal with. The look that made me question my own sanity, even when my gut was screaming the truth. I stared at him, this man I'd promised to love and cherish, and in that moment, I realized I didn't recognize him anymore. Or maybe, just maybe, I'd never really known him at all. Because the Mason I thought I married wouldn't demand I apologize to his female best friend for the crime of noticing their wildly inappropriate relationship. The Mason I married wouldn't gaslight me into thinking I was the problem when his emotional affair with Scarlett Pierce had been happening right under my nose for years. You want me to apologize to her? I heard my own voice, calmer than the storm brewing inside me. For what exactly? He didn't miss a beat. For treating her with suspicion and coldness since the day you met her. For making her feel unwelcome in our lives. For being so jealous you can't accept I have a meaningful friendship outside our marriage. His voice rose with each accusation, as if he was the victim here. Scarlett's been nothing but kind to you, and you've hurt her feelings with your constant attitude. She deserves an apology, and if you can't give her that, then I don't know if I can stay in this marriage. Something shifted inside me right then. Not heartbreak, not yet. That would come later. What I felt was clarity, cold and sharp as a blade. But I'm getting a little ahead of myself. Let me take you back to the beginning, to when I still believed in the life Mason and I were building together. I'm Maria Montgomery, and for 5 glorious years, I genuinely thought I had a solid marriage. We met at a summer barbecue, one of those perfect July afternoons where everything felt possible. Mason was by the drink cooler, and he looked at me with this genuine smile that made me forget I was supposed to play it cool. We talked for 3 hours straight, sitting on the back porch steps, the party swirling around us. He listened when I talked about my work as a graphic designer. He asked thoughtful questions. He made me feel seen in ways I hadn't experienced before. Our wedding came 2 years later. Small, meaningful, in a garden venue under string lights. Mason cried during his vows. My mom pulled me aside and said she'd never seen me look happier. We settled into our 2-bedroom apartment, planned our future, a house, kids, travel. Life felt stable, predictable, comfortable. I thought I knew exactly who I'd married. Looking back, I was living in a carefully constructed illusion. And that illusion started cracking about 6 months into our marriage. Mason came home from work one evening, practically radiating excitement. He sat me down and told me his college best friend, Scarlett, was moving back to town. He described her with a nostalgic warmth that seemed innocent enough then. Scarlett was brilliant, he'd said. One of those naturally charismatic people. I was genuinely happy for him. Everyone needs good friends, right? When I finally met Scarlett at a dinner Mason organized, she was exactly as he described. Polished, confident, attractive in a carefully maintained way. But what struck me immediately was how Mason and Scarlett fell into an easy rhythm within minutes. They laughed about professors I'd never met, reminisced about road trips I hadn't been part of, finished each other's sentences. I sat there, smiling and nodding, feeling like an observer. Their shared history created a language I didn't speak. Scarlett's husband, Elijah, was there too. He caught my eye at one point, and we shared a brief look. I didn't understand it then, but I'd come to recognize it later as a mutual acknowledgement of our secondary status. The first small boundary violation happened so subtly, I almost didn't notice it. A few weeks later, Scarlett started texting Mason during our date nights. We were at the movie theater, and his phone buzzed. He typed a quick response, put it away. 5 minutes later, it buzzed again. Then again. By the time the movie started, he'd exchanged a dozen messages with Scarlett. He apologized, promised to put it away, but it kept pulling his attention like a magnetic force. This pattern repeated itself for months. Dinner dates interrupted, weekend plans disrupted by calls about her marriage problems, late evenings spent typing responses while we supposedly watched TV. Each time I gently suggested he text her back later, Mason would look at me with barely concealed disappointment, as if I was failing some fundamental test of understanding. Then came the spare key incident. Mason gave Scarlett a key to our apartment for emergencies without discussing it with me. I found out when I came out of my home office one afternoon to find Scarlett sitting on our couch, shoes off, completely at home, while Mason made her coffee. She needed to borrow our Wi-Fi, she explained cheerfully, as if this was a recurring pattern I should have known about. I stood there in my own living room, feeling like an intruder. When she finally left, I asked Mason if we could establish some boundaries. Maybe Scarlett could text before coming over? His response was immediate and defensive. Scarlett's going through a difficult transition, he explained with exaggerated patience. New city, struggling marriage, high-pressure job. Real friends show up for each other without conditions or restrictions. Are you really going to be the kind of person who puts convenience over compassion? That conversation became a template for dozens more. Every time I tried to set a boundary, Mason reframed it as me being unwelcoming, jealous, unable to handle his friendships. I started second-guessing my own instincts, wondering if I was being possessive, unreasonable. Maybe this was what mature adult friendships looked like, and I was just too insecure to handle it. Our 5th anniversary arrived. I'd made reservations 2 months in advance at an elegant downtown restaurant. I wore the emerald dress Mason had complimented years ago. I'd planned the entire evening, dinner, a walk along the Riverwalk, then home where I had a custom-made photo album waiting, documenting our life together. We made it halfway through our appetizers before Mason's phone started buzzing incessantly. Once, twice, 5 times in rapid succession. His eyes glued to the screen while I sat across from him, watching myself become invisible in real time. That's when I said, those words, Mason, it's our anniversary. And that's when he looked up with genuine confusion and said, Scarlett's having a crisis. I'm just letting her know she's not alone. But I was alone, sitting across from my husband at an expensive restaurant on what should have been one of the most important nights of our year, while he provided emotional support to another woman. The irony was suffocating, bitter in my mouth. That night, lying in bed while Mason slept peacefully beside me, I finally admitted to myself what I'd been avoiding for months. My marriage had 3 people in it, and I was the least important one. 3 months passed after that anniversary dinner. 3 months of me trying to convince myself I was overreacting, that Mason's relationship with Scarlett was just an unusually close friendship. 3 months of swallowing my instincts and forcing smiles while Scarlett continued using her spare key to drop by unannounced, and Mason continued prioritizing her texts over our conversations. Then my laptop died. On a Wednesday morning in early December, right in the middle of a critical client project. The screen went black. Panic set in. I needed access to my work files, fast. Mason's laptop was in his home office. He told me dozens of times I could use it if I ever needed to, that we didn't have secrets. I grabbed it without hesitation, powered it up, and logged into my cloud storage. About an hour in, I realized I needed to reference our tax documents. Mason kept all our financial files on his laptop. I opened his file explorer and navigated to where he usually kept our shared documents. That's when I saw it, buried among work files, in a way that suggested it was deliberately hidden, but not well enough. A folder labeled Personal Private. Something about those 2 words together made my stomach clench. Mason and I didn't keep secrets. So why would he need a private folder on a laptop he'd told me I could use freely? My hands trembled slightly as I moved the cursor over it. Part of me knew I should close the laptop. Part of me hoped desperately I'd find something innocent. Maybe surprise birthday planning. I clicked it open. Hundreds of files, photos, screenshots, documents spanning back 3 years. My eyes tried to make sense of what I was seeing. Mason and Scarlett sitting across from each other at restaurant tables I didn't recognize. Leaning in close, conversation looking far more intimate than casual friendship. Candid shots of Scarlett laughing, her face glowing. Selfies of the 2 of them, his arm around her, both smiling like they shared something precious and private. And screenshots, Dozens and dozens of text message conversations. I clicked on the first screenshot. The timestamp showed 2 a.m., 6 months ago. Scarlett had written a long paragraph about feeling lost in her marriage to Elijah, about wondering if she'd made the right choices. Mason's response was equally long, validating every feeling, sharing his own thoughts about paths not taken, and connections that transcend normal friendship boundaries. I opened another screenshot, this one from a year ago, late at night again. Scarlett writing about how she couldn't sleep, thinking about different versions of her life. Mason responding with understanding and his own confessions about wondering what if, about having regrets he couldn't fully articulate to most people. My client deadline was completely forgotten now. I sat frozen, clicking through screenshot after screenshot, watching a hidden relationship unfold in documented detail. These weren't casual friend check-ins. These were emotional confessions, intimate late-night conversations where two people shared their deepest feelings, regrets, and longings. Then I found the message, the one that would replay in my mind for months, burned into my memory with the precision of acid etching glass. Scarlett had sent it at 2:17 a.m. about 8 months ago, right around the time Mason had started seeming distant. It read, "Sometimes I wonder what life would have been like if we'd gotten together instead of just staying friends back in college. Do you ever think about that?" Mason's response came just 3 minutes later, suggesting he'd been awake, waiting, or thinking about her at 2 a.m. instead of sleeping next to his wife. More than I probably should, but we made our choices. Doesn't mean I don't value what we have now. I read those words 3 times, 4 times, 5 times, hoping they would somehow rearrange themselves into something less devastating. But the meaning was crystal clear. My husband had feelings for Scarlett that went far beyond friendship. He'd been thinking about alternative versions of his life where they were together. And he valued what they currently had, whatever that was, enough to maintain it through years of secret communication. The worst part was the timestamp, 2:20 a.m. While I'd been sleeping in our bed, probably worried about some work project, Mason had been awake, engaging in emotional intimacy with another woman. I couldn't stop myself from digging deeper now. The Pandora's box was open. I closed the screenshots folder and opened our joint credit card statements. Every Tuesday afternoon for the past 2 years, a charge appeared at Riverbend Cafe, an upscale bistro downtown that Mason had never once mentioned. The amounts were consistently between $50 and $70, the kind of total for 2 people having a nice lunch. I opened Mason's digital calendar. There it was, plain as day. Every Tuesday at noon, a recurring appointment simply labeled lunch meeting. No client names, no location. Just a vague 2-hour block. I compared the dates of the Riverbend Cafe charges with the photos in his hidden folder. They matched perfectly. This wasn't occasional friendly catch-ups. This was deliberate, sustained, carefully planned deception. Mason had been building a parallel emotional life with Scarlett, complete with standing dates and intimate late-night conversations and shared secrets, all while coming home to me and acting like everything was normal. I sat at that desk for 2 hours straight, my client presentation completely abandoned. I read through every screenshot. I documented every suspicious charge. The evidence wasn't ambiguous. It wasn't a few questionable texts. This was years of documented emotional intimacy, financial proof of secret meetings, photographic evidence of a relationship that crossed every boundary. What made everything worse was the sudden clarity about how thoroughly I'd been manipulated. Every single time I'd expressed discomfort about Scarlett's constant presence, Mason had made me feel like the problem. He called me jealous, possessive, insecure. He'd positioned himself as the patient, reasonable partner, trying to help his wife work through her unfounded suspicions. He'd made me question my own instincts until I started believing my discomfort was a personal failing. But my instincts had been screaming truth the entire time. Every uncomfortable feeling, every moment of suspicion, every time I felt like the third wheel in my own marriage, all of it had been an accurate perception of a reality Mason was actively hiding from me while gaslighting me. I finally understood why Mason defended Scarlett so fiercely, why he prioritized her texts and calls, why he gave her a spare key, why he looked at me with disappointment whenever I suggested their friendship had unhealthy dynamics. Because in Mason's mind, I wasn't his priority. Scarlett was. I was the obligation, the legal wife. Scarlett was the person he thought about at 2 a.m. I had become the third wheel in my own marriage, and the evidence was spread across his laptop screen in undeniable detail. I sat at Mason's desk until the afternoon light shifted. My client deadline had passed hours ago. My phone had buzzed multiple times with messages I didn't read. None of it mattered anymore. Eventually, I forced myself to move. I found a USB drive and methodically copied everything. Every photo, every screenshot, every credit card statement. I organized it all into folders, building a case like a lawyer preparing for trial. When I finished, I sat back, expecting tears or rage. Instead, I felt a strange, cold clarity, a relief, knowing I hadn't been crazy. My instincts had been right all along. I looked at the clock. 3:45 p.m. Mason would be home around 6:30. I decided to give him exactly that, at least at first. I wanted to see if he could sit across from me and pretend everything was fine, knowing what he'd been hiding. I went to the kitchen and started preparing dinner. Chicken with roasted vegetables, one of his favorites. I set the table, put on background music, creating the illusion of normalcy. Mason walked through the door at 6:02 p.m., right on schedule. He looked tired. He smiled when he saw me, kissed my cheek. "Something smells good," he said, heading to change. "Rough day with that client presentation." "You could say that," I replied, my voice steady. I let him decompress for 15 minutes. He changed, poured himself a glass of wine, and settled onto the couch with his phone. I watched him scroll, probably texting Scarlett, completely oblivious. Then I walked over, his laptop already open to that hidden folder. I sat down in the armchair across from him, the coffee table between us like a moat. I turned the screen so he could see it clearly and asked the simplest question I could formulate. "What is this?" Mason looked up from his phone, confusion crossing his face. Then recognition hit him. His eyes widened. His mouth opened, but no words came out. For 3 seconds, panic flashed across his features, raw, unguarded. Then it was gone, replaced by something harder. Defensiveness. "You went through my private files?" His voice rose with immediate indignation. "Arya, what the hell? Those are my personal things. You had no right to go snooping through my laptop." The audacity stunned me. He wasn't denying what was in the folder. He wasn't apologizing. His first instinct was to make me the villain. "I was using your laptop because mine crashed during a work deadline," I said, keeping my voice calm. "I needed to access our tax documents, and I found a folder labeled private that contained evidence of a years-long emotional affair with Scarlett. So yes, I looked at it, and now I'm asking you to explain it." Mason set down his wine glass with more force than necessary. "There's nothing to explain. You're misinterpreting a friendship because you've never been able to handle me being close with Scarlett. This is exactly the kind of jealous behavior I've been trying to be patient with for months." I felt something cold settle in my chest. He was actually going to try to gaslight me, while the evidence sat between us on his laptop screen. "Mason," I read the text messages. "I saw the photos from your secret Tuesday lunch dates. I found the credit card charges at Riverbend Cafe every single week for 2 years. This isn't me misinterpreting friendship. This is you having an emotional affair and lying about it." "It's not an affair." Mason stood up, pacing, his voice taking on that exasperated tone he used when explaining something he thought should be obvious. "Scarlett and I are close friends. We have been since college. Yes, we talk about deep things. Yes, we meet for lunch regularly. That's what real friendship looks like, Arya. Deep connection, emotional honesty, mutual support. Just because you don't have friendships like that doesn't mean they're inappropriate." Every sentence was a deflection, reframing his betrayal as my inadequacy. I'd heard these tactics before, but never so blatantly. Never, while hard evidence sat between us. "She texted you at 2 a.m. asking if you ever thought about what life would have been like if you'd gotten together instead of staying friends," I said, my voice harder now. "You responded that you thought about it more than you probably should. That's not friendship, Mason. That's emotional infidelity. You're twisting things." He stopped pacing, taking private conversations out of context and building some narrative in your head because you're insecure about my friendships. "Scarlett and I talk about hypothetical scenarios sometimes. That doesn't mean anything inappropriate is happening." The argument continued for 2 hours, circling the same points. Mason deflecting, reframing every piece of evidence. He had an explanation for everything. The late-night texts were just friends supporting each other. The secret lunch dates were regular catch-ups he didn't mention because he knew I'd react badly. Every time I pointed out how his behavior crossed boundaries, he countered that I was the one with the problem. I was too jealous, too possessive, too insecure. I was exhausted. My head hurt from the circular logic, but I kept pushing because I needed him to acknowledge the truth. Needed him to stop lying and take responsibility. That's when Mason delivered the statement that would seal the fate of our marriage. He stood in the middle of our living room, arms crossed, jaws set. His voice took on that patronizing tone again. If anything, Arya, you owe Scarlett an apology. The words hung in the air. I stared at him, genuinely shocked into silence. She has been nothing but kind to you over the years, Mason continued, warming to his argument. She's tried to include you, tried to be friendly, and you've treated her with suspicion and coldness since the day you met her. She knows you don't like her. She's told me it hurts her feelings how you act around her, how you always try to limit our friendship. He was actually doing this. He was trying to make his emotional affair partner into the victim, and me into the aggressor who needed to apologize. You want me to apologize to her? My voice was oddly calm despite the rage building. For what exactly? For noticing that my husband was having an emotional affair? For being uncomfortable with inappropriate boundaries? For trusting my instincts when you spent months trying to convince me they were wrong? For being jealous and possessive and unable to handle me having close friendships? Mason's voice rose. For making Scarlett feel unwelcome and judged when she's done nothing wrong. She deserves an apology, and if you can't give her that, then I seriously need to reconsider this marriage. The room went absolutely silent. Even the background music seemed to fade. Mason stood there, arms crossed, clearly believing he held all the power. He thought he was calling my bluff, forcing me to choose between my pride and my marriage. He had no idea what he'd just done. Something shifted inside me in that silence. Cold. Clear. Absolutely certain. I looked at my husband, this man who was demanding I apologize to his emotional affair partner for the crime of noticing their inappropriate relationship, and realized he just handed me the perfect weapon. If Mason wanted an apology, he would get one. Just not the kind he was expecting. I let the silence stretch, watching him stand there in his self-righteous certainty. Then I spoke, in a voice much calmer than I felt. Fine. Mason's expression shifted to surprise. He'd clearly expected more argument. I'll apologize to Scarlett. I continued, my tone completely reasonable. But let's do it properly. At her house. With Elijah there, too. If I'm going to apologize for hurting her feelings, I want to do it right, in front of both of our spouses, so everyone can hear what I have to say. Mason's face lit up with relief, and something that looked disturbingly like triumph. He actually smiled, believing he'd won. Really? You'll do that? His voice was eager now. Absolutely, I said. Schedule it for this Saturday evening. I want to make sure everyone's there. I'll prepare what I want to say. Mason nodded enthusiastically, already pulling out his phone to text Scarlett. I watched him type, watched his face relax for the first time all evening, and felt absolutely nothing but cold clarity. He had no idea what I was actually planning. No comprehension that he just arranged the perfect stage for me to detonate the truth in front of everyone who needed to hear it. Mason spent the rest of that evening texting Scarlett about the arrangements, his face glowing with satisfaction. I watched him from across the room, feeling nothing but cold determination settling deeper into my bones. The next morning, Thursday, I woke up with absolute clarity. Mason left for work, kissing my forehead, reminding me to think about what I wanted to say. The moment his car pulled out, I returned to his laptop. I spent 3 hours methodically documenting everything. Detailed screenshots of every damaging conversation, organized chronologically. The early messages from 3 years ago were friendly enough, but then they shifted, gradually, into something deeper, more intimate, crossing boundaries incrementally. By the second year, Scarlett was texting him late at night about feeling disconnected from Elijah. Mason responded with paragraphs validating her every feeling, sharing his own struggles. They started using pet names. You always know exactly what I need to hear. I don't know what I'd do without you in my life. I organized it all into folders labeled by year and month, creating a timeline that would be impossible to dismiss. Then I compiled the financial evidence, highlighting every Tuesday lunch charge at Riverbend Cafe for the past 2 years. I calculated the total Mason had spent on those secret lunches, over $7,000, on meals with another woman while we'd been saving for a house. Then I found something that made my stomach turn in a different way. Buried in Mason's email inbox were receipts for gifts he'd purchased for Scarlett, a designer silk scarf for her birthday last year, $250, a bottle of expensive French wine for her promotion 6 months ago, $180, flowers delivered to her office when she closed a major deal, $75, with a card that read, "Always knew you could do it. So proud of you." These weren't casual friend gestures. These were the kinds of gifts you bought for someone you were romantically involved with. The card messages crossed every professional and platonic boundary. I printed everything, created digital backups in 3 separate cloud storage accounts Mason didn't have access to, even saved copies to 2 different USB drives. I wasn't taking any chances. By Thursday afternoon, I had built an airtight case, but I still had one more thing I needed to do. Something that required courage I wasn't entirely sure I possessed. I needed to call Elijah Pierce. I sat at our kitchen table, staring at my phone for 10 minutes. I'd probably spoken directly to Elijah fewer than a dozen times. He was quiet, reserved. But I'd seen something in his eyes at gatherings, especially in recent months. A kind of resigned awareness. The same look I'd probably been wearing myself. My finger hovered over the call button. Part of me wondered if this was going too far. But another part of me, the part that had been gaslit and manipulated for months, knew that Elijah deserved the courtesy of a warning. He deserved to know his world was about to change. I pressed call. He answered on the 3rd ring. "This is Elijah." "Hi, Elijah. It's Arya Montgomery, Mason's wife." I kept my voice steady. A brief pause. "Arya, is everything okay? I'm calling because Mason has arranged for me to come to your house on Saturday evening to apologize to Scarlett. He insisted the apology happen in front of both of you, and I wanted to make sure you'd be home for it." Another pause, longer this time. I could almost hear him processing the layers of meaning. When he spoke again, his voice had changed. More alert. Focused. "I'll be there." No questions about what the apology was for. No confusion about why I was calling him directly. Just immediate understanding. "Thank you," I said quietly. Then, because I needed him to understand what was really happening, I added, "I think there are some things you should know. Things that have been going on that you might have suspected, but didn't have proof of." The silence on the other end was heavy with recognition. Finally, Elijah spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you for calling me." Those 5 words carried the weight of years of suspicion. "You deserve to know the truth," I said. "We both do." "I'll be there Saturday," he repeated. "And Arya, whatever you're planning to say, I'm ready to hear it." We hung up. I sat there, feeling the weight of what I'd just set in motion. Elijah knew something was coming. Meanwhile, Mason came home that evening in an excellent mood. He'd apparently had lunch with Scarlett that day, their regular Tuesday having shifted to Thursday. He talked enthusiastically about how grateful Scarlett was that I'd agreed to apologize, how much it would mean to her to clear the air. I nodded and smiled, internally reviewing my evidence. Friday was more of the same. Mason coached me repeatedly on what to say. He'd actually written out bullet points on his phone. Acknowledge my jealousy. Admit I'd misinterpreted their friendship. Thank Scarlett for her patience. Express gratitude. He even suggested I bring an expensive bottle of wine as a peace offering. "Really show her you're serious about making amends," he said earnestly. I agreed to everything. I practiced the humble facial expressions. I asked clarifying questions about tone and body language. With each coaching session, Mason's confidence grew. He'd successfully trained his wife to perform public submission. Friday evening, he actually hugged me and said he was proud of me for being mature enough to work through my issues. I hugged him back, feeling the unfamiliar weight of deliberate deception. I'd learned from the master. That night, I lay in bed next to Mason, listening to him breathe peacefully, completely unaware that tomorrow would detonate his carefully constructed world. Sleep wouldn't come. My mind kept circling, examining my motives. Was I becoming vindictive? Was public humiliation really the answer? But every time doubt crept in, I remembered Mason's face illuminated by his phone screen at our anniversary dinner. The disappointed looks he'd given me. The patient, patronizing tone. The way he'd made me question my own sanity. I thought about all the women who stay silent because speaking truth makes other people uncomfortable. And I realized that what I was planning wasn't petty revenge. It was justice, clarity, and the kind of truth-telling that shatters comfortable lies people have been living in for too long. When dawn finally broke, I got up with absolute certainty. I wasn't nervous anymore. I was ready to deliver the apology Mason had demanded, just not the one he'd scripted. Saturday arrived with clear skies. I spent the morning moving through our apartment like someone preparing for battle. Mason interpreted my quiet focus as nervousness, kept reassuring me everything would be fine. I let him believe whatever he needed to believe. By 5 p.m., I was dressed in a simple navy dress. Mason had picked out the expensive bottle of wine that morning. He wrapped it carefully, treating it like some kind of peace offering. We left our apartment at 6:15 p.m. for the 25-minute drive to Scarlett and Elijah's house. Mason insisted we take his car, presenting what he called a united front. He drove with one hand on the wheel, the other occasionally patting my knee. He talked the entire drive about how meaningful this was, how proud he was of me, how our marriage would be stronger. I watched suburban streets slide past, houses with families enjoying the evening. None of them had any idea that in one of those similar-looking houses, for lives were about to detonate. Mason kept glancing at me with this hopeful expression mixed with nervousness. Part of him probably wondered if I'd actually go through with the apology he'd scripted. I gave him nothing. My expression remained neutral. I held the wine bag carefully. I nodded when he talked. I smiled when he squeezed my knee. I was the picture of a contrite wife, ready to make amends. When we pulled up to Scarlett and Elijah's house at exactly 6:40 p.m., I noticed all the interior lights were blazing. Through the large front windows, I could see Scarlett moving around, arranging something on their coffee table. Even from the car, I could tell she'd gone to effort for this, setting the stage for what she believed would be her validation and my public submission. Mason parked, turned off the engine, and sat for a moment. Then he turned to me with an expression of such genuine emotion that I almost felt sorry for him. "Thank you for doing this," he said quietly. "I know it's not easy, but this means everything to me, Arya. Everything. Our marriage is going to be so much stronger after tonight. You'll see." I looked at my husband, this man who had gaslit me for months, who had demanded I apologize to his affair partner, who genuinely believed this evening would strengthen our marriage by cementing another woman's permanent priority in his life. "I know it will," I said, and squeezed his hand back. That was the last moment Mason would look at me with trust or affection, though he didn't know it yet. We walked up to the front door together. He rang the doorbell, even though we could see Scarlett heading toward us. She opened the door before the chime finished, her smile wide and barely concealing her smugness. She looked perfect, of course. Designer jeans, a cream silk blouse, highlighted hair. She'd clearly dressed for this occasion. "Mason! Arya! Come in!" Her voice was warm and welcoming, playing the gracious host. "I'm so glad we're doing this. Really, clearing the air will be good for all of us." Mason handed her the wine. Scarlett made appreciative noises, though she set it aside without much genuine interest. She was focused on me, studying my face, trying to gauge how thoroughly Mason had broken me into compliance. Elijah appeared from the kitchen. The moment our eyes met, I saw everything I needed to know. He was alert, watchful, braced for impact. His expression had none of the resigned exhaustion I'd seen before. He knew something significant was about to happen. And unlike Mason and Scarlett, he was prepared for it to be uncomfortable. "Arya! Mason!" He nodded to both of us, his voice neutral. Then his eyes found mine again for just a fraction of a second, and I saw acknowledgement there. Recognition. Maybe even gratitude. We all moved into their living room. Scarlett and Elijah settled onto their gray sectional couch. Mason and I took matching armchairs across from them. A glass coffee table, carefully arranged with wine glasses and a cheese board, created a barrier between us. Scarlett had clearly spent time staging the scene. The room itself felt theatrical, like we were all actors who'd been given scripts. Except only I knew what the real plot was about to be. Mason settled into his chair and gave me an encouraging nod. His expression radiated excitement mixed with relief. Scarlett folded her hands in her lap with gracious expectation, her posture perfect, her expression carefully arranged into magnanimous forgiveness. Elijah leaned back slightly, arms crossed, watching everything with focused intensity. He was the only person in that room besides me who understood that something was about to shift. I took a deliberate breath and set down my wine glass. The sound of glass meeting would seem unnaturally loud. I looked directly at Scarlett, holding her gaze, and began speaking in a voice that was calm, measured, and gave nothing away. Scarlett, I want to start by saying that Mason was absolutely right. I paused, letting those words settle. Her smile widened slightly with validation. I do owe you an apology. Another pause. Scarlett's posture relaxed. Mason's face lit up. Elijah's expression didn't change at all, but I saw his eyes sharpen. But not for the reasons you think. The atmosphere in that living room shifted so dramatically, I could almost feel the air pressure change. Mason's encouraging smile faltered, freezing on his face. Scarlett's expression transformed from gracious acceptance to cautious uncertainty. Elijah leaned forward slightly, his full attention locked on me now, every muscle in his body alert. I continued in that same calm, measured voice, not raising my volume, just speaking truth with the kind of clarity that comes from absolute certainty. I apologize for staying silent when I should have spoken up years ago. I apologize for allowing you and Mason to continue an emotional affair right under my nose while convincing myself I was the crazy one for feeling uncomfortable. Mason tried to interrupt, his voice sharp with warning. Arya, what are you? I raised my hand, cutting him off mid-sentence without even looking at him. My eyes stayed locked on Scarlett's face, watching her carefully constructed facade begin to crack. Let me finish. You demanded an apology. I'm giving you one. I turned my attention to Elijah, whose face had gone completely still. I pulled out my phone with hands that were steady despite everything, opened the folder I'd so carefully organized, and began speaking in that same measured tone. I apologized to Elijah, actually, because he deserved to know the truth about his wife long before tonight. For the past 3 years, Mason and Scarlett had been meeting every Tuesday for secret lunch dates at Riverbend Cafe. They'd been having late-night text conversations about alternative life choices they wished they'd made together, about intimate regrets and emotional connections that cross every boundary a married person should respect. I handed my phone directly to Elijah. He took it with trembling hands. His eyes moved across the screen, reading the first message, then scrolling to the next. The color drained from his face so completely he looked like he might be sick. But his hands kept moving, kept scrolling, methodically reviewing every piece of evidence I compiled. Mason was on his feet now, his voice rising with panic. Elijah, don't listen to this. She's taking things completely out of context. You know how Arya gets about my friendship with Scarlett. She's always been jealous, and now she's trying to destroy. How long? Elijah's voice cut through Mason's explanation like a blade through paper. He didn't raise his volume. He didn't need to. The coldness in those 2 words silenced everything else. He was still looking at my phone, but his question was directed at Scarlett with absolute precision. The room fell into a silence, so complete I could hear someone's watch ticking. Scarlett's mouth opened and closed several times. Her perfectly composed expression had cracked completely. Tears formed in her carefully made-up eyes. She tried the reflexive denial first, her voice shaking. It's not what it looks like. Mason and I are just close friends. We've always been close. There's nothing physical between us. Nothing inappropriate has actually happened. Elijah finally looked up from my phone, and the expression on his face made even me take a step back. It wasn't rage, exactly, though that was there. It was something colder, more devastating. Recognition, vindication, years of suppressed suspicion, finally given permission to surface. I didn't ask if you slept with him, Elijah said, his voice still controlled, but carrying an undercurrent of fury that was more frightening than shouting would have been. I asked how long you've been having an emotional affair with Mason while making me feel crazy for noticing. The parallel to my own experience was so perfect it felt orchestrated. We had both been living the same nightmare of gaslighting and manipulation. Both told we were paranoid or insecure. Both made to feel like the problem, while our spouses maintained an inappropriate relationship. Scarlett's carefully maintained facade shattered completely. Tears spilled down her cheeks. Elijah, please. You're misunderstanding. We never meant for anything to. 3 years. Elijah's voice was flat. According to these messages, this has been going on for at least 3 years. 3 years of secret lunches. 3 years of late-night conversations about regretting your life choices. 3 years of you telling him things you never told me. He scrolled further, jaw tightening. Here's one from 8 months ago, where Scarlett asks Mason if he ever thinks about what life would have been like if he'd gotten together instead of staying friends. And Mason responds that he thinks about it more than he probably should. Mason had found his voice again, but instead of apologizing, he went straight into damage control. He was standing now, face flushed, pointing at me. Arya, you're destroying everything. This isn't what I meant when I asked you to apologize. You twisted what I asked you to do. You've taken private conversations completely out of context, and you're using them as weapons to hurt people who've done nothing wrong. His voice cracked with desperation, trying to reframe my truth-telling as manipulation. He turned to Elijah, palms up. Look, Elijah, you have to understand. Scarlett and I have been close friends since college. We have history. Yes, maybe we talk more than typical friends. Maybe we're more emotionally connected than some people might think is appropriate, but nothing physical has ever happened between us. We've never crossed that line. Arya's jealousy has blown a close friendship completely out of proportion. But Elijah wasn't listening to Mason's revised narrative. He was still scrolling through my phone, reading message after message where Mason and Scarlett crossed boundaries no amount of explanation could justify. His expression grew colder. It says here, you bought her a designer scarf for her birthday. Elijah said quietly, reading from the email receipts I'd included. $250. An expensive wine for her promotion. Flowers sent to her office. He looked up at Scarlett. You told me those flowers were from a grateful client. Scarlett's tears were flowing freely now. Elijah, I can explain. How much? Elijah cut her off. How much money has Mason spent on you over the past 3 years while telling me we needed to be more careful with our budget? Mason's attempts to control the narrative were falling apart in real time. The evidence spoke louder than his deflections. I stood up slowly, smoothing my navy dress, picking up my purse. The time had come for me to leave. I looked at Mason directly, meeting his eyes for what would probably be the last time with any kind of intimacy. You demanded I apologize for speaking truth. I just did. You told me to do it in front of Elijah. Done. You threatened me with divorce if I didn't comply. Well, Mason, consider this my answer to that threat. Then I turned to Elijah, whose expression had shifted to something complex. Painful gratitude mixed with devastation. Anger at the betrayal mixed with relief at finally having proof he wasn't crazy. I've sent you copies of everything to your email address. All the screenshots, all the financial records, all the evidence you need to make informed decisions about your marriage. You deserve to know the truth, and I'm genuinely sorry I didn't tell you sooner. Mason grabbed my arm as I moved toward the door. His grip was tight enough to hurt. You can't just walk out. We need to talk about this, Arya, please. You're my wife. We can work through this if you just calm down and be reasonable. I pulled my arm free with more force than I'd intended. No, Mason. You need to talk to your lawyer. Because I'm done being the understanding wife in a 3-person marriage where I was always the least important person. I walked toward the door without looking back. Behind me, I could hear Scarlett sobbing. Elijah's cold questions continued. Mason's increasingly desperate attempts to explain, to justify, to salvage something. But none of it was my problem anymore. I stepped out into the cool October evening air and closed the door behind me, muffling the sounds of their imploding marriages. The suburban street was quiet, peaceful, completely at odds with the devastation I'd just left behind. I pulled out my phone with shaking hands and called for a rideshare. The driver arrived within 10 minutes. I climbed into the back seat and gave him my address, then spent the entire drive staring out the window. Part of me wondered if I should feel guilty for the devastation I'd caused. I destroyed my own marriage, yes, but I'd also destroyed Scarlett and Elijah's. I'd humiliated Mason and Scarlett publicly, but mostly I felt relieved. Like I'd finally stopped carrying a weight I hadn't realized was crushing me for so long. When the rideshare dropped me off, I walked through the lobby feeling like I was moving through a different world. I unlocked our door and stepped inside. Immediately, the space felt different. Lighter somehow. Less suffocating. Mason's things were everywhere, but they all felt temporary now, like artifacts from a life that had already ended. I poured myself a glass of wine, sat on our couch, and let myself feel the full weight of what came next. I sat there, nursing my wine and waiting. Part of me wondered if Mason would come home at all that night, but some deeper instinct told me he'd come back, if only to try one more time to control the narrative. His key turned in the lock at 11:47 p.m. I'd been watching the clock, existing in that strange, suspended state between exhaustion and hyper-awareness. The door opened, and the man who entered our apartment looked nothing like the confident husband who'd left it just 5 hours earlier. His face was ravaged, eyes red and swollen. His hair stood up in places. He looked like someone who'd aged a decade in an evening. He stood in the doorway, staring at me. Then he closed the door with careful control and walked into the living room. The look on his face was something I'd never seen before. Equal parts devastation and fury, grief and rage, all competing for dominance. How could you do that? His voice came out raw, scraped clean of its usual confident tone. How could you humiliate me like that? Destroy my friendship? Share private conversations that you had no right to see in the first place? I took another sip of wine and said nothing. I'd said everything that needed saying at Scarlett's house. Now it was Mason's turn to deal with consequences. He started pacing, jerky and agitated. You violated my privacy. You went through my personal files, read my private messages, and then you weaponized them to hurt people who've done nothing wrong. Do you understand what you've done? You've destroyed 2 marriages because you couldn't handle me having a close friendship. This was the anger phase. Deny, deflect, attack. Make the person who discovered the betrayal into the villain. I let him pace and rant for 20 minutes, cycling through accusations about my jealousy and insecurity. Then he shifted strategies. He sat down across from me, elbows on his knees, hands clasped, a posture that suggested vulnerability and remorse. Look, I know I made mistakes, he said, his voice softer now. Maybe Scarlett and I got too close. Maybe I didn't set appropriate boundaries. But we can work through this, Arya. We can go to couples therapy. I'll put distance between myself and Scarlett. Whatever you need. Our marriage is worth fighting for. This was the bargaining phase. I set down my wine glass and looked at him directly. Mason, I'm filing for divorce. His face went through another rapid evolution of expressions. Shock first, then calculation, then manipulation. You're overreacting, he said, his voice taking on that patronizing tone again. You're emotional right now, understandably, but destroying our marriage over a friendship that you misinterpreted isn't the answer. You're letting your insecurities ruin something good. This is exactly what I was trying to help you work through. And there it was. Even now, even caught with irrefutable evidence of his emotional affair, Mason was trying to make this my failing. I stood up and walked to our bedroom without another word, closing and locking the door behind me. I heard Mason call after me, heard him try the door handle, heard him spend another hour pacing the living room. Around 2 a.m., I heard him finally settle on the couch, probably too exhausted to keep performing. The next morning, he tried yet another approach. The wounded husband who just wanted to save his marriage. He called in sick to work and spent the entire day following me around our apartment, trying to initiate conversations about rebuilding trust. But I was done. Done fighting, done explaining, done accepting blame for other people's betrayals. On Tuesday morning, exactly 1 week after I detonated our lies at Scarlett's house, I called Victoria Brennan. I'd gotten her name from a colleague who spoke highly of her strategic approach to difficult divorces. Victoria had a reputation for being thorough, uncompromising, and completely unsympathetic to spouses who tried to manipulate through gaslighting. Her office was downtown, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Victoria herself was in her mid-50s, professionally dressed, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. Our first consultation lasted 2 hours. I showed her everything. The chronological screenshots, the credit card statements, the photos, the email receipts. Victoria reviewed each piece of evidence with focused intensity. When she finished, she sat back. Emotional affairs are harder to prove than physical ones in divorce proceedings, but the documentation you've compiled is exceptionally comprehensive. This shows a clear pattern of deception spanning years, financial evidence of resources being diverted outside the marriage, and communication that crosses appropriate boundaries. We can absolutely use this. She laid out her strategy. File for divorce on grounds of marital misconduct based on emotional infidelity. Push for a favorable settlement. He'll try to make you the villain, Victoria said with the confidence of someone who'd seen this exact scenario play out dozens of times. He'll claim you're jealous, vindictive. Don't let him. The evidence speaks for itself. I hired her on the spot. 2 weeks after the explosive apology, I received an email that surprised me. The sender was Elijah Pierce. Subject line, "Thank you." I opened it with curiosity. He explained he had filed for divorce the Monday after our confrontation. Armed with the evidence I'd provided, it was impossible for Scarlett to deny or minimize what had been happening. He asked if we could meet for coffee sometime, carefully clarifying it wasn't anything romantic. He just wanted to talk with someone who understood exactly what it felt like to be the third priority in your own marriage. I agreed. We met at a small cafe downtown. Elijah looked different than I'd ever seen him. The resigned exhaustion was gone, replaced by something more solid and present. He looked like someone who'd finally stopped carrying a weight. Our conversation flowed easily. No need for pretense. We'd both already seen each other at our worst moments, been publicly humiliated in the same living room. Elijah told me about years of watching Scarlett's face light up when Mason called, about expressing discomfort and being told he was too sensitive. It was like listening to my own experiences reflected back at me. We'd been living parallel nightmares. Through mutual friends and occasional social media observations over the following months, I learned that Mason and Scarlett tried to make a real relationship work after both divorces were set in motion. The predictability of it was almost funny. Once their connection was no longer forbidden or secret, once they had to deal with actual relationship logistics instead of stolen emotional moments, the fantasy collapsed under the weight of mundane reality. They lasted exactly 4 months. Mutual friends reported growing tensions almost immediately. Scarlett struggled with Mason's financial situation after divorce settlements. Mason discovered that Scarlett's constant need for attention, which had seemed endearing from a distance, became exhausting when it was his full-time responsibility. The relationship that had seemed so special and deep turned out to be mostly illusion. They broke up quietly, a sad fizzle that proved what I'd suspected all along. What they had wasn't love. It was the thrill of emotional affairs. 6 months after that explosive Saturday night, I sat in Victoria's downtown office, signing the final divorce papers. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, casting long shadows. Victoria had negotiated a settlement more favorable than I'd expected. Mason agreed to split our savings evenly, let me keep the apartment, even pay half my legal fees. Victoria suspected his unusual generosity stemmed from wanting to end proceedings quickly before more details of his relationship with Scarlett became public record. I signed my name on page after page, watching my signature legally transform me back into just Arya Montgomery. Each signature felt like closing a door I'd been trying to shut for months. When I signed the last page, Victoria smiled. "Congratulations, you're officially divorced." I shook her hand, gathered my copies, and walked out. I'd expected this moment to feel heavier, sadder. Instead, I felt lighter than I had in years. The afternoon sun seemed brighter, carrying the kind of promise that comes with genuine new beginnings. My weekly coffee meetings with Elijah had continued throughout the divorce proceedings. What started as mutual support between two people who'd survived similar betrayals gradually evolved into something more complicated. We talked less about past pain and more about present lives and future possibilities. We discovered shared interests that had nothing to do with our failed marriages. Old black and white films, hiking trails that were slightly difficult to find, quiet mornings where silence felt comfortable. One Wednesday afternoon, Elijah suggested we meet for dinner instead of coffee. "There's a new Italian place that opened downtown," he said, his voice carrying a hint of nervousness I found endearing. "I thought maybe we could try it together if you're interested." I looked at this quiet man who'd survived the same betrayal I had, who understood what it felt like to be gaslit. We were both gun-shy about jumping into anything serious, both carrying damage that would take time to heal. But we'd built something honest between us, a foundation based on truth instead of illusion. "I'd like that," I said. We took things slowly, aware that trust rebuilds gradually. But the foundation felt different this time, solid in ways my marriage to Mason never had been. I ran into Mason unexpectedly about 8 months after our divorce was finalized. I was in the grocery store produce section, reaching for a bag of organic apples, when another hand reached for the same bag. We both pulled back, started to apologize, then recognized each other. Mason looked different. Older. More worn. New lines around his eyes. More gray in his hair. He'd lost weight. We stood there awkwardly for a moment. "Arya," he said finally. "How are you?" "I'm good," I replied simply. "Working on some interesting design projects, enjoying the apartment, building a life that feels right." Mason nodded. "I'm glad you're doing well." He looked like he wanted to say something more. Finally, he spoke quietly, almost too soft to hear. "I made mistakes. A lot of them. I handled our marriage poorly. I wish I'd listened when you tried to tell me the truth about my relationship with Scarlett. The apology was real. I could hear that, but it came far too late. Some things can't be unsaid. Some damage can't be undone." I appreciated the acknowledgement, but felt nothing beyond that. No anger anymore. No hurt. Just recognition that this was a person I used to know who taught me important lessons about boundaries and self-trust. "I appreciate you saying that," I replied. There was a pause. Then I asked, "How's Scarlett?" Mason's expression closed off immediately. "We broke up months ago." Turns out what we had didn't translate well into an actual relationship. Once it wasn't secret anymore. He laughed without humor. "I'm living in a studio apartment across town, working through my own process of figuring out who I am outside the fantasy I'd been maintaining." We parted cordially, both of us aware that some bridges, once burned, can never be rebuilt. They can only be acknowledged as part of the landscape that shaped us into whoever we become next. Today, I live in an apartment that no longer carries any trace of Mason or our marriage. I redecorated completely. The bookshelves hold novels I want to read. The walls feature artwork from local artists whose work speaks to me. The furniture is arranged for my comfort. The silence here isn't lonely. It's peaceful. The sound of a life reclaimed, of boundaries respected, of truth spoken without apology. Elijah and I are still taking things slow, still rebuilding trust. But what we're building feels different this time. Honest instead of performed, based on respect instead of manipulation, built between two people who understand the value of truth because we both pay the price for living in lies. I think about that night sometimes, that explosive apology that detonated multiple lives in Scarlett's carefully staged living room. Part of me still wonders if I could have handled it differently, more privately, with less public devastation. But mostly, I understand that some truths need to be spoken loudly. They need to be witnessed by everyone who's been affected by the lies. Mason wanted me to kneel and apologize for hurting Scarlett's feelings. I gave him exactly what he demanded. I just made sure the apology revealed every uncomfortable truth he'd been working so hard to hide. The moral crystallized clearly over these months of rebuilding. Never force an apology from a woman who speaks truth. Because women like me don't apologize for seeing clearly. We apologize for staying silent too long. And when we finally speak, we burn down every carefully constructed lie. Mason learned too late that forcing someone to apologize is only a victory if you control what they're apologizing for. I didn't bow for truth. I weaponized it. And in doing so, I reclaimed my life, my dignity, and my understanding that sometimes the most powerful thing a woman can do is refuse to pretend anymore. The silence I live in now isn't the silence of submission. It's the silence of peace that comes after you finally stop carrying other people's lies and start living in the clear, bright light of your own truth. So, tell me, after hearing all this, what would you have done in my place? Would you have confronted him privately, or do you think some truths need to be delivered exactly how I did? I'm genuinely curious to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for listening.